Well, good afternoon and good evening, everyone. So delighted to be with you for this conversation. This is one I've really been looking forward to as I've dug into this guy's background and all the incredible work they're doing. What a year it has been for the world, but what a year it's been in trying to understand the plight and the future of the worker. Guy Ryder, really nice to chat with you across an ocean. We were comparing notes before we came on air. And what a year it's been. I want to start there. What has this year been like for you in Geneva?
It's been, I think, like everybody around the world, all of a sudden, no warning, our lives have been turned upside down. That means the way we work. I'm sitting in the ILO building. We normally have about 1,300 people in. I guess we've got 50 in here right now. The world of work has been turned upside down, so our professional lives have been transformed, but also our personal lives. I think this has been a deeply human crisis. I think each of us, with our families, with all of our private as well as professional interests, has felt that this has hit us more than anything, I guess, that any of us have ever known. That's the truth.
I think you're exactly right. It's interesting to hear that perspective from you because you've seen some things over the course of your career, for sure. And I want to zero in on a few of the things that you mentioned there, and one of which is just the future of work. It feels like we are reconsidering almost everything when it comes to not just careers, but even the day-to-day operations of companies. Take us inside, help us understand sort of how you and the team sort of strive to get your arms around that. You've done some incredible and in-depth research, but I wonder, before we get into that research, share with us some of the process.
Yeah, well, I mean, before this weird year, last year was our centenary year. We were 100 years old, the oldest of the international organizations. And we decided to mark last year by just exactly what you're talking about, an in-depth examination of what we felt the future of work had in store for us. And we were aware at that time that there were things transforming the world of work, most obviously technology, but also demographics, climate change and what we have to do about climate change, and this rather uncertain path of globalization. So we put together a global commission to look into these things, chaired by the President of South Africa and our Prime Minister of Sweden. We adopted a declaration in June of last year, and we sort of felt that we'd established a roadmap for the future direction of the world of work, not as we thought it would unfold, but in terms of what we thought we should be doing to make it what we want it to be. And all of that was set out. We were sort of starting on that process, and then this pandemic struck us. And interestingly, instead of relegating all of that work we did last year to the dustbin and saying, well, we're overtaken by events, it actually confirmed that many of the things we looked into, many of the policy lines we were pursuing, actually stood up and become even more relevant in this time of COVID-19.
Well, that's such an important point, I think, because it feels like, and keep me honest here, it feels like one of the things we're reckoning with here at the end of 2020 as we see, I'm speaking to you on a day where the first vaccines are rolling out across the United States to frontline healthcare workers. There is light at the end of the tunnel. We know it's going to be a dark couple of months. And yet, as we reckon with this, it feels like the pandemic laid bare, in many cases, things that were already there. And I wonder, talk to me about what it confirmed. Take me a level down in terms of the things that you saw in 19. And then as 2020 went on, you said, yep, we were right about that.
Yeah, right. I think you're absolutely right. Just like the virus itself, the economic and social impact of the pandemic has been to expose the pre-existing conditions that afflicted the world of work. And it's shown that there are enormous vulnerabilities in the world of work, great precarity in the world of work. And that would apply to the most advanced economies, just as it does to the developing economies. And so as this pandemic has hit us, we've seen those vulnerabilities exposed. It's made us think of how we really need to act to remedy those things. But at the same time, and this is, I think, very, very worrying, what we've seen is that those who are most vulnerable in the world of work, most disadvantaged in labour markets, they have paid the heaviest price of this pandemic. If you were worse off at the beginning, you're even worse off now. If you were relatively comfortably off before, you're probably weathering this storm pretty well. And so there's an accentuation, I think, of inequality and division, which I think, and this is perhaps one of the very few positive things one can see from this pandemic, I think it's concentrated people's minds on things that we had not addressed in the past, but we really cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, ignore right now. And I'll give you one example, Jason, and just think of the frontline workers. They've become the heroes of this pandemic, and rightly so. There's about 170 million health and frontline care workers. Add to those supermarket cashiers, bus drivers, cleaners, all of those people we now know are essential, but massively undervalued in terms of the work that they do and the conditions under which they work. So just one example of how we're having to perhaps think again. Things we always knew, but we didn't do a heck of a lot about.
So let me ask you a very simple and yet complicated question, or it's a simple question with a complicated answer. I would imagine it could probably take us the rest of the day and into tomorrow, your time at least, which is why? Why did we ignore this for so long?
That's about political decisions. You see, I think we've labored under a sort of an illusion. It was a convenient illusion that in this, let's say over the last 30 years or so, I think the last real reset in our thinking about the world of work came end of the Cold War, the 80s. For someone from my country, it was about Thatcher and Reagan. Don't know how that looks to a Canadian audience. And we decided basically to put our money on globalization, market liberalization, with technology as a major driver of change. And we let it go. We sort of let it rip. And the state sort of made itself small, got out of the way. And the good news about all of that was, with some ups and downs, we recorded respectable rates of growth. We saw, extraordinary performance in some countries in eliminating extreme poverty. And so the feeling was, this works, but there are some side effects. There are some side effects like growing inequality, the fact that wages for 30 or 40 years have grown much less quickly than productivity, with the obvious consequences for the rewards to labor. So long as the music continued, we just danced to the tune. And we put aside, I think, all of these unfortunate side effects. And I repeat, I think this pandemic really needs to make us stop and think about all of this once more.
Exactly. And I do, want to dwell on one point that you made, which is this notion, and I think we'll revisit this throughout the conversation, this notion that for a segment of the population, and maybe it's small, but it's a very significant and vocal part of the population. I think about, candidly, my friends and family, a lot of people that I know here in the New York area, life's been okay. It's been uncomfortable at times. It's been, you and I were joking beforehand. I'm talking to you from my 2-year-old daughter's bedroom. I've got all sorts of technology set up. And so aside from her mild annoyance at that, there's not much to complain about for a lot of white collar workers who have sort of gone about their day. That's reflected in the stock market. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This K-shaped recovery does candidly worry me a little bit, because you do have a segment of the population who may just sort of soldier on. How much do you worry about?
I worry about it a great deal. I think your diagnosis is absolutely right. Now, it would be stretching it, wouldn't it, to say anybody's enjoying this pandemic. We all want to see our friends. We all want to have the personal liberties. God help us. Some of us want to go back to the office if we're not able to go there. There is a social thing about work which often gets forgotten, but people miss the social interaction of work. But yes, looked at it in objective terms, there are certain echelons of the labour market who are doing okay. If you can get over the boredom and the tedium of it, we've learned how to work remotely. We've worked out Zoom and all the other platforms. It's okay. So there is a difference, I think. We use these words sometimes interchangeably, and it's wrong. Many of us can adapt because we have the types of jobs, and we have the technologies at our disposal. We have the employers who want us to adapt and help us to do so, and we can adapt with relative comfort. That is different from resilience. Now, other people are not adapting because they don't have jobs that can adapt. They just have to grit their teeth and try to get on working at the same things, sometimes in dangerous circumstances, sometimes in absolutely impossible conditions. Let me give you the extreme example of what I'm trying to say. If I were to ask you, Jason, how many people work informally in the world? What percentage of people work informally in the world? That is to say, without any social protection, without any labor legislation covering them. People guess wildly. The truth is it's just over 6 out of every 10. Just over 60% of people, 2 billion people, they work informally. And in some countries that goes up to 80 or 90%. Now, the idea of being able to choose between going to work or locking down is entirely theoretical for them because, if they don't work, at the end of the day, they don't eat and their families don't eat. So these people just have to carry on, grit their teeth. They're not adapting at all. They have no means to adapt. They're just being resilient, often at great personal cost and to their health as well. So there's a massive divide here. This is not just about inequality. I actually think that this pandemic shows that we are on different sides of divides in society. Divides, those of us who have formal or informal jobs, those of us who have social protection or not, those of us who have an established and relatively permanent labor contract and identifiable employer or not, those of us who have a house from which we can work and be connected digitally or not. So there are not just inequalities, there are divisions becoming very apparent. And I think as you talk about a K-shaped recovery, which means different trajectories potentially coming out of this crisis, I think that becomes a generalized concern. And yes, I do worry about.
And so let's talk about some of the solutions because, there does seem to be an admission, an acknowledgement of a lot of what you're saying. And, we all know that sort of acknowledging you have a problem is often the first step. And yet we also know that there are specific things that need to be done, both from the private and the public sector. You speak to people across the spectrum. We're at an interesting, I dare say, geopolitical moment right now. The Electoral College here in the United States is doing its business today. What, as you think about the recommendations, and maybe let's talk about that informal economy, because that 2 billion figure that you shared, I saw that in some of your research, and I had to go back and make sure that I was reading it right. That is unbelievable.
It is.
We know about this informal economy in both rich and not as rich countries. What do we do about that from a policy perspective? What are the recommendations that you have?
But we have actually been working at the informal economy, formalizing the informal economy for over a decade in our most recent efforts. And, there is no silver bullet to this, I'm afraid to say. It's not just companies or employers or workers trying to evade the formal economy. Often administrative procedures, financial availability means that people just cannot go formal. It's uncomfortable or unviable for them to do so. So what we see, and where we've seen progress, it's been a combination of measures. You need proper administrative processes. You need financial support. You need to adjust fiscal systems. You need to make social protection available to people. And actually a lot of mentoring when it comes to micro enterprises. They need to get into relationships with bigger enterprises, which are not predatory but supportive. And then, and with clear political leadership, governments have to want to change this. You can actually make some considerable support and some considerable progress. And in Latin America, in recent years, before things got tougher in Latin America, there were some very, very significant reductions in informality. So the thing about it, and I always make the same comment about child labor or forced labor in the world, it is not an inevitable side effect of poverty or underdevelopment. It's something which is amenable to policy action. And I think that is also the answer to a lot of the other things we're facing now. we're not trying to predict what the future of work might look like. We're trying to work out the policies we need to make it like we would want it to be in the future. It's in our hands.
One of the things that I also came across in your research, which is related to this, is we all know that many of the industries that have suffered so much in the pandemic are related to tourism and travel. These are, in many cases, a lot of the workers that you're talking about, lower wage earning. If they don't work, they don't get paid. If they don't get paid, they and their families don't eat, as you very pointedly said. The other interesting thing about that is that disproportionately affects women. I wonder if you can share with us some of that research and also how that may have to be dealt with pointedly in the short term, because it feels like progress was being made and now we've fallen back.
Yeah, if you were to ask me, well, who have taken the hardest hit from this crisis in economic and social terms, I'm not going to surprise you. It's women. It's young people, desperately so, by the way, Jason, and also the lower paid. As I said earlier on, the lower paid you are, the worst it's got. So in terms of wages, there's a strong downward pressure on wages in the course of this year. The overall figure is about 6.7%. For women, that's over 8%. So they've taken a bigger hit on wages. They've been displaced from work rather more quickly and in larger numbers than their male counterparts. And somewhat counterintuitively, because we often think the flexibilities which remote working might offer us would enable women to reconcile family and professional responsibilities better, give them greater choice. The opposite's happened. I mean, as what we can see is, as we've gone into remote working, in fact, professional and private responsibilities have absolutely accumulated for women. So they've come out worse in all regards. And think about the starting point. Globally, the global wage disparity for men and women, it sort of hovers around the 20% mark. So we started from a really bad place, and it's simply getting worse. And we've been at this for a very long time. Again, I think it reflects the fact that women are still subject to disproportional disadvantage at work, segregated in those sectors which have been vulnerable to the pandemic, still picking up the great burden of unpaid care work, and simply not breaking out of these things. And there's going to be an interesting time when it comes to rehiring, when we get our economies going again, Jason. Are women going to go second in the queue to the men on that one? There's anecdotal evidence that suggests that they might, unless we act differently.
Right. Tell me more about the youth aspect of this, because that was something that actually surprised me. You think of sort of youth being, again, sort of broadly more resilient, and yet that's not the case when it comes to the research and the data that you have found. Help me understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, 2 or 3 things about that. Firstly, youth unemployment in the world, before the pandemic hit, was still higher than it was before the 2008 financial crisis. Youth never found their pre-existing place in labor markets. They were in bad shape. Youth unemployment was twice as high as general unemployment. Secondly, education and training has been massively interrupted. For some, of course, they've been able to migrate to remote working, distance learning, although that has a very strong economic and social component to it as well. If you're from a less advantaged home, perhaps where education doesn't come from parenting as well, you don't do very well in those things. Thirdly, if you're a young person coming on the labor market right now, as needless to say, the prospects are not great, are they? And just to put the icing on this very unpleasant cake, 1 out of every 6 young people who was in a job at the beginning of this pandemic has lost that job. They're being expelled from the labor market in disproportionate numbers. So if you were to ask me if there's any one sector of the labor market that I think we need to be really, really, really worried about, it's young people.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Anecdotally, I was speaking with someone over the weekend, and a neighbor, sort of socially distanced on our street as we were. This is a kind of like I guess, funny aside, because Santa Claus was coming down the street. The only way we're going to see him is if he's perched on top of a fire truck and we're all standing back and watching. This is 2020. But one of the things that this guy was saying to me is that if you're established in a job, adjusting to remote work is, as you say, like it can be a little bit tricky, but the socialization, the existing relationships are there. But even in white collar work, for a young person who doesn't have those existing networks, who doesn't have that existing sort of acculturization, if that's even a word, to the organization or even to the work world, they will have a disadvantage that may exist for some time, I would imagine.
Well, I think that's right. I think the reason why young people are losing their jobs more quickly than others, and it's pretty intuitively comprehensible, is simply that they've joined the labour market relatively recently, by definition, and often the first steps in the world of work are on short-term, precarious contracts, 0 hours contracts. So when a company is looking to offload some labour, it's the easiest, it's cheapest, it's the first thing that comes to mind. And hey, they'll get by. They can go back and live with mum and dad, and they'll find something coming by because they're like that. These millennials. It's a rough deal. Let's be honest. It's really hard, and all of the evidence shows, Jason, that if young people are out of the labour market for a prolonged period at the beginning of their professional career, a year or more than that, the scars last a lifetime. Their earnings over a professional career are correspondingly reduced. There's even evidence to show that it affects longevity. It affects mental and physical health. So we really need to take this seriously, and we can't just wait for the storm to pass. We've got to look to these youngsters to help them out.
That's interesting. One of the things that also strikes me as you're talking about that is the mobility as it relates to globalization, both at the higher end of the workforce, but also I know you've done some work around migrant labor as well, which obviously is affected both by the pandemic as well as candidly a recent skepticism around globalization. I think that certainly we've seen here in the United States and has swept the world. Help me understand sort of how that fits in together, because you've got a lot of people, as I understand it, from the migrant workforce who have been unwillingly, in their perspective, sent back to their countries and unable to earn a living overseas.
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps the most dramatic manifestation of the pandemic. I mean, in a number of countries which, rely very heavily on migrant workers and have fairly well-established ways of recruiting them, when the economy basically seized up under the effects of the pandemic, these people were simply sent home. If they were lucky, they got an aeroplane home. They were put on an aeroplane and got home. If they were unlucky, they got sent to a border. And there's a very large number of them stuck at borders right now. It's a drama. Now, the thing obviously that needs to be done there is to regard migrant workers as people having the same rights at work and human rights as anybody else. And it's unacceptable to treat them that way. But that's happening. That's the first thing to say. And indeed, remittances from migrant workers are down massively worldwide, with enormous development problems there. We've seen as well that some of the major health problems, pandemic problems in some countries, Singapore's the best example, they all came from the dormitories where migrant workers are basically close together. So the health problems, the socio-economic problems, the human rights problems are all coming together. All of this, regrettably, in a world where the debate on migration has become, I'm afraid, very toxic. It's not been a pleasant debate for reasons we all know about. And part of the recovery process, this building back process, I think has got to include a new dispensation around migration, because we haven't been doing well on migration. We really haven't.
And so we only have a few minutes left, and I'm ultimately going to end on an optimistic note. I'm promising the audience that we're going to end on some sort of optimistic note. Before we get there, though, I did want to ask you, and maybe there's some optimism here because of the vaccine. Are we more aware of the health and safety of workers? Do you think that we will be maybe smarter and candidly more humane about that going forward, having seen what we've seen now?
Jason, I think it's a great question. It's a great way to sort of conclude on something more promising. The first thing I want to say is I often hear conversations which say, when we're trying to be optimistic, say, well, there are opportunities in this pandemic. What are the opportunities? And my answer to that is I can't see opportunities in the pandemic itself. It is a bad thing. It's lousy. It's awful. Don't talk about opportunities. The only thing the pandemic allows us to do is just to think a little bit more carefully. Now, the pandemic does not enable us to do anything that we could not have done previously. If we'd have been sort of energetic enough, we could have worked out how to work remotely. We could have organized ourselves on platforms. All of this was possible. The only thing about this pandemic is it's brought to the surface all of these vulnerabilities, all of these things which I think by common agreement, we really would not like to see in anybody's society, and which is actually dangerous to the sustainability of our societies. My boss, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said it very well. For a very long time, we've been operating on the assumption that a rising tide of growth and prosperity will lift all boats. He said the reality is that the rising tide of inequality is going to sink all of our boats. So think again. And I think that is the message. So when you're talking about the future of work, please, let's not limit it to a discussion about whether we'll all be sitting in our daughters' bedrooms or our kitchen tables, working in isolation using technology. It's an interesting debate. It's an important debate. But there is a massively more important debate about how we're going to build back better and address everything from inequality to climate change, which we haven't touched on,
right.
To debt and to financing for development. Big debates going on. Let's take the broadest possible take on this pandemic and learn the lessons. That's all it is. Learn the lessons.
Well, and I do think, and before we wrap up, I did want to ask you, what you just said sort of spurred a thought with me, which is, we are hearing corporate leaders, it feels like, and maybe, I like to think of myself as an optimist, even though I'm a journalist, but I do hear, it feels like in a more meaningful and productive way from corporate leaders that they feel like they do bear a certain amount of responsibility. We heard the Business Roundtable a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, as you know, here in the United States, talk about, expanding the importance of sort of accountability beyond just shareholders. So that's a good, important first step. If you, and when you are talking to corporate leaders, what do you advise them to do when they say, listen, God, what can I do for my workers? What's an quote unquote easy thing that I can do? What's the low hanging fruit, as it were, just to give us a little bit of a homework assignment before we sign off.
Well, I want to agree with you, journalist or whatever we are. Look, the corporate world is got to be a major part of the answer to these questions. We've got a long-standing debate about shareholder and stakeholder capitalism. We should not and cannot ask the private sector to run this race on their own. They need regulation, they need governments, they need the state to play their role, to provide the enabling conditions, not as a constraint, not as something against business interests, but giving the right incentives, the right rewards, so that businesses, will do the right things, as I think they're inclined to do. I think the discourse is changing on climate change. I'm really encouraged about that. But wouldn't carbon pricing help companies do the right thing? It's got to be a real public-private joint endeavor, and everybody has a role to play there.
Well, you have given us a dose of realism, but also some optimism. I really, really appreciate it. It's nice to spend some time with you. I look forward to a time when we can get together in person in one of these cities around the world when that's all possible again. So, Guy, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Nice to spend some time with you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.